Okay, now let's do it. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out here tonight. My name is Jenny, and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's going to go. So first, we'll be doing an audience hand-raised Q&A towards the end of the event. So start thinking about questions to ask now and raise your hand when the time comes. Anne or Naomi will then repeat the questions into their mics to ensure that viewers on the live stream can hear as well. And then after the talk, Anne will be signing and personalizing books at that alcove right next to the register at the front of the store. It's a little hidden, so we'll point it out to you at the end of the night as well. And then if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Body Horror online using the link in the live stream description. Okay. So it's my privilege to introduce Anne Elizabeth Moore and Naomi Huffman, who are here today to discuss the newest edition of Body Horror. Body Horror is a cult classic cataloging the global toll of capitalism on our physical autonomy. Weaving together unflinching research and surprising humor, these essays range from investigative to uncomfortably intimate. Informed by her own navigation of several autoimmune diagnoses, Moore explains what it takes to seek care and community in the increasingly complicated, problematic, and disinterested U.S. healthcare system. Featuring an updated introduction and new essays, as well as illustrations by Xander Morrow, this new edition of Body Horror is a fascinating, insightful portrait of the gore that encapsulates contemporary American politics. Anne is the author of Unmarketable, the Eisner Award-winning Sweet Little Cunt, Gentrifier, which was the NPR Best Book of the Year, and others. She's the founding editor of the Best American Comics and the former editor of Punk Planet, the Comics Journal, and the Chicago Reader. Moore currently teaches at the School of Visual Arts and lives in New York. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Naomi is here to discuss Body Horror with Anne. Naomi is a writer and editor and the co-founder of Hagfish, an editorial studio and publishing project. She's also the editor of 2 books of previously unpublished work by the late Catherine Dunn, including Toad from last year and Near Flesh, a collection of short stories, which publishes next year. So without further delay, everyone please give a very warm welcome.
I have an update already to that introduction of the book. I'm just going to jump in. I know there have been no questions. The entire staff of my hospital's primary care system, so all the GPs quit last month. So now my hospital has no general practitioners. So talk about disinterested healthcare system.
Totally.
Anyway, here's some jokes. Thanks for coming out tonight.
I mean, it's on the cover that there are jokes, so
That's true. Yeah,
it's not unexpected.
That's good.
Do you want to read first, or
Yes, desperately.
do you want to read from my copy?
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to hear something from the book?
Yes.
Woo! Okay. Yay. This, I'm going to just go with a crowd favorite, generally speaking. It's about the sanitary napkin disposal bag. Yeah. The essay opens with a description of a woman who was hired in the 1920s to explain why Johnson & Johnson's menstrual products weren't selling to women. And if you're familiar with the phrase on the rag, you have a vague sense of why the menstrual products weren't selling to women, because women were just making their own. So Gilbreth's dedication to ensuring access to menstrual products that people might actually use allowed the sanitary napkin industry to survive and soon thrive. Just skip that part. The field quickly grew to offer a stunning variety of contraptions and palliatives, all intended to further mask the menstrual cycle as women entered and then gained standing in a workforce dominated by men. Noting that no concurrent moves have been made to socially normalize the regular occurrence of menstruation, the notion that Hillary Clinton might use a restroom for any purpose whatsoever was enough to set off opposing presidential candidate Donald Trump after one 2016 debate, for example, may spark the realization that the entire sanitary product industry exists to allow menstruators to pass through an arena undetected by cis men without raising alarm. Continue on this thought trajectory for too long, however, and you'll discover that far more effort has gone into the innovation of menstrual pads than into the establishment of women's rights, which is a line of thought I do not advise for those who already suffer from depression. Devices new to the market in the last century or so, therefore vary in both considerateness and usefulness. Absorbent underpants, one might argue, offer little that menstrual pads don't, although other recent inventions are slightly more innovative. Tampons, absorbent insertables intended to soak up menstrual blood, take some adjusting to, as does the menstrual cup, another form of insertable that pretty much does what it says on the tin. Each carries potential hazards that range from embarrassing to life-threatening, but all allow for unimpeded movement with little blood overflow, unless you're on a heavy day and you sneeze. Douches, on the other hand, intended to eliminate certain smells, come with fairly serious health hazards. They temporarily wipe out odor-creating bacteria, but also eliminate odor-eating bacteria, subsequently killing off your body's ability to regulate its own smell, or, more dangerously, fight infection. Other sprays, ointments, and gewgaws abound, each purporting to serve the basic purpose of masking half the world's natural bodily processes from the other half. Not to get too 12-year-old boy about it, but it's difficult not to burst out laughing at the ridiculous products those of us who menstruate are urged to make use of just to experience the pleasure of going outside. One standout product in the menstrual hygiene field is the lowly sanitary napkin disposal bag. It is possible that you have never seen one. Actually, I just spoke to someone yesterday who had never heard of the menstrual product that I am referring to. So pay attention if you don't know what I'm talking about. It is possible that you have never seen one, so let me describe them for you. First and foremost, they are bags, a fact central to their oft-mocked status. Usually paper, although occasionally plastic, they are intended to house soiled sanitary products, shielding contents from view of other restroom users. They have no other intended purpose. Because you are extremely unlikely to require them in the privacy of your own home, such bags are found most frequently inside the stalls of public restrooms, although never on the shelves of your local drugstore. Basically fancified scraps of paper to rack waste in, the devices come heavily decorated. Sanitary napkin disposal bags may be decorated with happy, willowy figures engaged in playful activities such as tennis or dancing, or festooned with gay flowers. Some may feature a stick figure in a dress delightfully throwing an object into the garbage. Others recall a traditional, frequently Victorian, notion of femininity, and thus convey decorum. The ad copy for a stainless steel garbage receptacle into which such a bag is meant to be placed similarly claims it, quote, adds a touch of class to any restroom. Class-striving discretion is important. These bags do hold a specific kind of very dirty garbage from other garbage, presumably, from which other garbage presumably must be protected. But on the whole, sanitary napkin disposal bags strive to express ease of use, tranquility of mind, or maybe even fun. The bag's lighthearted design schemes contrast starkly with manufacturers' overt marketing strategies. These can be found on product descriptions in office supply catalogs, promotional copy intended for the purchaser rather than the user. Sanitary napkin disposal bag producer Sensibles, in the section of its website labeled The Solution, lists a myriad of problems facing all who enter women's restrooms. Microbes, smells, spillage, needles, and blocked plumbing. All somehow removed by the addition of a branded receptacle for pink plastic bags. An apparently short-lived website in 2014 called Teens and Parents went a step further, quote, disposal of sanitary napkin is the major problem polluting the environment. Not offered for comparison was the pollutive output from sanitary napkin manufacturing plants. The nicknames used when the products appear in books and films and on shows or podcasts are no less alarming. Sanibag, individual feminine hygiene receptacle, ladybag, and even vagina bag. I'll stop there. I think you get the point.
for reading that one. It's one of my favorites.
It's one of my favorites too. It's the essay on which I stake my claim to be the leading expert on sanitary napkin disposal bags in the world.
I would say you are.
I think I might still be.
Well, I'm glad you read it as well, because I think that it's just one of the most like quintessentially Anne Elizabeth Moore essays, in that you have taken a single object, which I see every day and don't think that much about, and it turns out you in fact have thought a lot about it.
And done every imaginable bit of research you could do into it.
Totally. And yeah, you use this everyday object to then write about so many forces and so many issues that we live with today. And yeah, from a multifaceted perspective that I think, in the hands of a lesser essayist wouldn't have been so complex. And yeah.
Thank you for that. That's very kind.
Of course. In a way, it feels like we're traveling back in time because, of course, this is the second edition of Body Horror, and we got to work together quite closely on the first edition.
This book wouldn't exist without Naomi accosting me in a bar and saying, I want you to write a book for me.
And maybe we should talk about the origins of the first edition of Body Horror, because it wasn't a book that you planned to write.
No.
But one that I was like, I think you should write this book.
I was explaining it to someone the other day as we there's some of this that you and I haven't talked about, but Naomi was working for someone that I didn't like very much. I think we have talked about that part. And was sort of like he's a somewhat disreputable publisher, and so I was like, oh, I don't want to work with that guy, but I want to work with this lady. So when you were like, let's do a book together, and I was like, okay, here's a bad idea, like you really want to work with me on this? It's a bad idea. And you were a little bit like, actually, that's a good idea. Yeah, that was pretty much how that conversation went.
That was the whole conversation.
Yeah, I think there was 3 glasses of wine involved.
At least,
yeah,
maybe more. So some of the essays in Body Horror then date back to the early 2010s, and the original edition was published in the spring of 2017. I'm going to quote from the introduction to that original edition. You wrote it, you said, in case you being the general reader, you haven't figured out yet that what we are facing at this moment is institutionalized misogyny at the service of capitalism. To describe to you how truly terrifying this is, and to display the experience we all share of being bodies subject to a harsh, cruel world. I think there was something about the newsletter that you were writing at the time of the same title, Body Horror, that had this perspective and that said brilliant sentences like that all the time. And I felt that in my my reading circles and in the books that were being published around that time, that this kind of perspective was sorely lacking. So I feel that in part then, like, some of the strong reaction that you've experienced from readers about Body Horror is the very, like, points to that scarcity of this kind of essay writing. Can you talk a little bit about what other readers have said to you about Body Horror and what it means to them? The first edition, that is.
Yeah. I mean, I got a wave of emails when the book came out from people who were actually in the hospital. And they were like, look, I don't know, somebody gave me this book, and then I found myself super sick, and like on the way to the emergency room, I just grabbed it because whatever, and now this is what's keeping me alive. Like, I am connecting with this in a way that is making me understand why I need to keep going. And I mean, I got like 6 or 7 emails of that caliber that were just so, like, stunning to my core. But also people writing to me in sort of non-illness related circumstances, being like, oh, I just feel like I understand the world better now. The connections that I sunk into over the course of reading this book make me understand why I feel the way that I feel when I walk around. And stuff like that is so meaningful as a writer. I mean, it's just so, that's why you do it, right? To give someone the tools to understand their own world better.
Mm-hmm. And who are some of the writers that did that for you? Made you understand or helped you understand the world better?
I mean, I think that it's possible that Elizabeth McCracken is one of the first writers that I ever read, that made me get both something about the way that she writes about disability is really great, and the way that she combines sort of humor and aspects of horror or terror or just super strangeness resonated with me really, really early. And then in terms of nonfiction writers, there's Paulo Freire and Susan Sontag, and I mean, I'm a little overwhelmed trying to answer that question, because I feel like everything I read at some point is just like, oh, this is why I'm alive, you know, this is why I'm doing things, and then I go into the next book and I'm like, no, this is the
So part of what I think is genius about the book is how, and again, I guess I'm referring to the first edition again, is how it sort of pointed to many imminent crises that you, of course, could not know, well, how imminent, I guess they were. So the first edition went to press in January 2017. Of course, that month, President Trump, a xenophobic racist, as we all know, became president.
What? Is that what? This can't be true.
Later that year, the Me Too movement took hold and called for accountability in some of the same ways that you were in the first edition of the book. A couple of years later, the COVID pandemic exposed a lot of the inadequacies of our healthcare system that you also wrote about. Roe versus Wade fell last summer. There's just many things that have happened that feel like, if you weren't foretelling them in body horror, they certainly felt like there was something about the urgency of that first edition that really primed, I think, me and a lot of other readers to pay more attention. So yeah, I think that's part of its strength. But amid this, just absolute utter bullshit of what is going, of all these ongoing crises.
Can I? It's shocking to hear them all listed, right? Still, and we survived them, and we're dealing with the world in which they happened, right? It's still shocking to imagine that collection of things happening. Mm-hmm. And to a great degree, you're right. I kind of saw it coming, and I feel like I've said this about a lot of things lately, but even though you see something coming when it happens, it's still so bananas. Mm-hmm. It's unthinkable. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would like to ask you, as the editor of that first edition, without whom really this book wouldn't exist without Naomi, when you were working on the book, how much of it were you well, this is crazy, this is never going to happen?
None of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it all felt very much of our world at that time. I did feel there was a sense of urgency that felt, as I mentioned, quite unique to the work, but I think that was also why I was excited about it. It was you taking so seriously these possible series of calamities in a way that no other writer that I was reading at the time really was. So I think it was that singular aspect of your perspective that resonated more with me than any notion that any of it felt impossible or out of reach in some way.
That's interesting.
I guess I've always been curious, what the experience of writing the book was like. The essays are, obviously some of them weren't written for the book, they were written for other publications, other projects, but it's not a fun book to sit with and read, right? And I mean, the experience of editing, one feature of editing the book was, a sense of uncomfortable dread. You must have also felt that as the writer.
I think the dread is why I do the writing. Maybe. And so once it's on the page, I feel like then it's not dread anymore, it's just work. And then I can do something else. But, you know, when I'm writing about horrible things, either that have happened or that will happen or that might happen, we're going to talk about my podcast later. There's this, like, you have to gain or feel some kind of sense of control over how they narratively unfold. And so I think probably the trick of my psyche is that writing is the way that I don't feel overwhelmed or filled with dread every minute of the day. So so I acknowledge that dread is there, and I acknowledge that I am using it and attempting to build it throughout the course of the book as a narrative device that is also deeply emotionally manipulative. Sorry, but that I think at some point I am able to disengage from it and just let that be like a writerly trick. But yeah, it was a book that I was like describing horrible things and feeling horrible things. I was super sick when I wrote the first edition, like in kind of a general body way, and then the second edition actually was, I had a kind of a similar thing, like my arm was going and it like not working, and nobody could really figure out why. And writing, I'm right-handed, so it was pretty dramatic. And there were days that I could kind of like, you know, type a little bit with my left hand, but really even sitting up was asking too much. So there's a way that like, that even felt appropriate to how the book was going to work. So there's this way that you feel, you know, the degree to which you feel as a writer like you're bleeding onto the page, like I really felt like I gave it what I had, you know, like I suffered for that book every time it, you know, has happened. And that feels then a little bit like it's maybe okay the degree to which readers suffer when they read it. I think that's, you know, not asking you to do something that I haven't done myself. But the other thing about the dread aspect is that now that I'm an adult or something, I think that I have held this belief in my mind for a really long time that, you know, sunlight was the best disinfectant. Like you could write about something, you could kind of narrativize it, you could fact check it, you could get it on the page, and you could like describe horrible things in great detail, and that would somehow cause them to disappear and that they didn't happen anymore after you'd clarified them in text. And over the course of maybe even like it was the first edition of this book through the actual appearance of the second edition of this book, I think that those were the years when I realized that like that's a lie. Like there's no disinfecting this stuff. It's just gonna be there. I mean, whatever, maybe I'm just being a total depressive right now, but like it doesn't actually change anything to set it in text.
Right.
Am I being a depressive?
No, you're fine.
Okay.
I do want to ask you about the last line of the introduction to this second edition, which is, "This edition is written just for you." Was that in response to reader feedback and the way, I mean, you seemed slightly surprised by the way readers, like how connected some readers were to the first edition. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, because it's a weird book. And I think, I mean, to whatever degree you and I were both excited about it, and I was excited about working with the Feminist Press on it again, I think everyone is aware that like you don't really put film criticism in a book about disease. You don't really open with labor politics in Cambodia and then jump to models. There's a lot of things about it that kind of fundamentally wouldn't seem to work from the outside. So structurally it's weird, and then the forms of criticism that unfold within it are weird, but also it was so many different kinds of weird that I expected people to like it or think it was interesting, but not for people to write me from the hospital with it. And I've had very passionate enthusiasts / fans, including stalkers and crazy letter writers and people that really go too far with their devotion to my work or who they perceive me to be. But this book just had thoughtful, dedicated, devoted readers almost from the get-go that also really appeared to engage in a way that I had intended with the book, which was seemed real and deep, and that's what I meant with that line.
Yeah. So as we've referenced a few times, part of why Feminist Press is reissuing Body Horror in the first place is that the previous publisher collapsed and the first edition was out of print for a few years. Which is not an uncommon experience with a small press, but certainly one that, endangers the work of writers like you, perspectives like yours, which aim, of course, to espouse difficult ideas and alternative ideas, alternative lifestyles, and ways of living. So what are some of the consequences of a precarious small publishing community industry?
Yeah, which is another way of asking how I've survived the last 50 years of my life, and now you have probably, not quite 50. That's just such a massive question. I'm not quite sure still how to answer it, but one of the things that happens that we understand about the world and that we understand about living in a capitalist culture is that even things that purport to be slightly less capitalist or, born out of mutual aid or deliberately anti-capitalist, all of these things are still kind of influenced by the same social forces that affect everything else. And so what we tend to have is the same power structures that exist even within these alternative or independent or underground spaces. And so a lot of the time it is straight white cis men with more money than anyone else in the room that feel more comfortable saying what they think is right, and then that standing unopposed. And I have seen that be the downfall of independent publishing just over and over and over, in independent presses and all sorts of things that otherwise we believe are doing something kind of interesting and unique in the world, and that's cool.
Do you want to talk about some of the small publishing projects that you've started? Maybe Pressing Concern?
Pressing Concern. Yeah, Pressing Concern is my publishing project that I keep in my back pocket whenever somebody brings up an idea, and I'm like, that's a good idea. They're like, yeah, but nobody will ever publish that. And I'm like, oh, but actually I will. Here's $9, and I will photocopy the shit out of that for you.
Well, how was that? I guess we're criticizing small publishing in a way, but it's also so pleasurable and it's so much fun. And there's something about publishing with small presses that you must also really enjoy and really love. You keep doing it over and over again.
Yeah, it's true. And it is the particular combination of ways that I think about the world and objections that I have to the ways that other people think about the world. Those are easier to explore or easier to get folks to allow me to explore in sort of underground or in more independent spaces. And then, I mean, pressing concern is kind of a good example of this. It's just this dumb, meaningless thing that that still ends up being a way of exploring ideas that literally just wouldn't exist anywhere else. So, series of essays written as bookmarks and sort of, you know, printed really tiny and intended to have a relationship or a dialogue with the books that they are marking. Like that just seemed like a kind of interesting way of exploring literature, and so I did that for the first year of the pandemic, first year and a half of the pandemic or something. And that way of allowing ideas to operate in culture, I think, is really important, regardless of how quickly it fails or how many people it hurts.
People it hurts. Well, it's also, what did you call it? Dumb and meaningless?
Yeah.
It's neither of those things, but that's fine.
I like things that are dumb.
Right. Well, you can maybe clarify your definition of dumb then. But
Yeah, I hold dumb and ridiculously
high
high regard.
Okay, so obviously, part of reissuing the second edition is to get it back in print, but it's also just a really great fucking book. And you took the opportunity to, update a lot of the essays and refine some of the ones that were in the previous edition and add some new writing as well. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what that was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, some of it, there were a couple essays that were written right after the first edition of Body Horror appeared that just were so like relevant and kind of needed to like fit in there. And then there was some that like during the pandemic, it was like, oh, this is just body horror too. Like if body horror 2 ever happens, I'm just gonna, and then it was like, oh, I guess it's happening. So it was pretty easy to kind of reformulate the collection without letting go of any of the original standards. But then what was interesting was having to go back and edit some of the pieces that were kind of imagining the end of a Trump presidency or imagining something like a Me Too movement or envisioning the end of Roe v. Wade, and just like changing sentences from like, maybe this would someday happen to like, this happened in November, or, and then he, led an armed revolt against the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was overall quite an odd experience, actually.
Oh, I imagine. It was also an odd experience rereading some of those essays for that same reason. Just some of the language that was speculative then became quite affirmative.
History, even.
Totally. One of the essays that you updated is a few things I have learned about illness in America. Can you talk about the updates that you made to that essay and why?
Yeah. So there were like 3 everyone's favorite essays, and this was the sort of central one that just kind of collected like things, like little pieces of advice that I would give to someone who suddenly found themselves sick in the US. And a lot of them were about kind of like suddenly finding yourself a person with disabilities in a very ableist world. But then, of course, once the pandemic happened, there was so much more that was about like not seeing yourself reflected even in a culture that thought it was trying to protect you. Mm-hmm. And so then I had to kind of update it so that immunocompromised people in particular, in an imagined future where immunocompromised people would be facing a different pandemic that from which we had learned nothing during this last pandemic, that so that they wouldn't feel crazy which I think was one of my number one experiences during this pandemic, when people are constantly telling you like, oh no, we're totally concerned about you, you the immunocompromised, we must protect them at all costs, just like not with masks or vaccines or any restrictions on engaging socially whatsoever.
Yeah. I want to talk very quickly, or just acknowledge very quickly, that the cover designer of Body Horror is a person named Xander Morrow, who you've been friends with for how long? Decades?
20 something years.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit, because I feel like the cover and the interior illustrations, they're kind of a unique feature of the book, and the cover always elicits like very strong reactions, of course. Can you talk about how great it is that this cover has remained intact on both editions, and maybe that wouldn't be possible if you were working with a small press. It would be harder to convince perhaps the marketing department of like a Big Five press to put oozing bodies on a book cover.
I think it would be, but also, I mean, the great thing about working with feminist press, I think, was that they just kind of read and understood that as important and central to the book on its own. So, I was delighted that they were as enthusiastic about that as I was. But yeah, working with Xander is just such a treat to find an illustrator that you can kind of be like I remember in the very first round of illustrations that she turned in, she was like, well, I thought that I would illustrate this aspect of this story, and then we would da-da-da-da-da, and what do you think about this? And she was being very like professional illustratory about it. And I was like, oh no, Xander, this is not, like, I want you to do what you do, and then the parts of it that work with this book, we mush them together. And then she kind of came back with all this very crazy stuff, which is then what ended up being the frontispieces in the book. And she just has this amazing imagination and skill and style that I completely aspire to. She also has about as much hair as I do, and so we're very comfortable communicating with each other.
Yeah, she's wonderful. Very just a very singular individual, I would say.
Yeah.
We are running out of time. I do want to ask you one more question, which is about your podcast, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience.
Okay.
Your podcast is called My Inevitable Murder. Maybe you can give us a little
explanation
on it very quickly.
So it's a true-ish crime podcast in which I track down my own murderer. And the reason that I'm kind of doing it now is because I had lost for a long time this pure sense of comedy, and it turns out that investigating your own murder is like so much fun. And getting, I live in this kind of conservative part of the state, and one of the things that I am doing with this podcast is trying to get my neighbors on record talking about my murder. And part of the reason that I am doing that is because I don't want them to actually murder me. And so if I could get them to like talk with me and joke with me about the idea of it, then they would be much less likely to become angry with me at some point and then actually murder me. Plus they know that that would be documented. So, but yeah, everything about it is really fun, but then also like it is in many ways the kind of next evolution of something like a body horror project, is to really just dig in and make jokes about your own impending death with like whoever comes across your path. My Inevitable Murder, it's a lot of fun. If you have any tips, we have a tip line. Please call with tips, because there's no clues yet. So please give us some clues if you have any.
And where can people listen to My Inevitable
Wherever
Murder?
podcasts are, whatever they are, wherever you download your favorite podcasts.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. We are going to open it up to questions now. I think you can just raise your hand and state your question, and then I will actually repeat it for the folks who are joining us on the live stream.
And you can ask me anything, because honestly, I'll just answer you.
We haven't even talked about cats yet or
No.
hot sauce, and those topics are definitely on
Yes,
the
ask
table.
me about hot sauce. That's all I talk about is hot sauce.
And tell us about your hot sauce company.
I am starting a hot sauce company, which is even dumber than my stupid podcast. Yeah, so I have been on the phone with the FDA all week arguing about hot sauce. It's so dumb and so awesome, and I love it. That's hot sauce.
Do you want to talk about the hot sauces that you're developing?
I only want to talk about hot sauces. But it's not very literary.
I think that's okay.
I'm making one with a lot of chipotle and guajillo and chocolate, and it's very like spicy and delicious. And it's called Mud. Yeah, that'll be the first one. But it's very expensive to get a hot sauce made in this country. So we're only going to be making one at a time and releasing them very slowly.
What is there a brand name?
Yeah, Tinkertown Provisions is the name of my hot sauce company. And we actually are opening a restaurant in about a month. So come on up to upstate New York when it opens. You can follow Tinkertown Provisions on Instagram. I will alert you all to when it comes to fruition, which will be in the next couple of months. And you can come have some hot sauce and find out whether or not you like my books by whether or not you like my hot sauce.
Any other questions?
Real questions.
I think it's a real question based on what you just said. So you said you live in a part of the state that is hostile.
The question is, so you say you live in a part of the state that is hostile.
I live in a traditionally very red county that also happens to be the seat of the opioid crisis. So hostile or?
You said your neighbor.
And yeah, a lot of, there's a lot of unique things about the place that I live, but it is a village where people reenact the Civil War.
What makes you stay there? Just out of curiosity.
I'm super interested in the origins of the opioid crisis.
Aha.
And also there's a lot of bookstores.
Aha.
Like
Yeah.
the most bookstores, right? In like per capita in
There's
New York
8.
State.
And there's only 500 people.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting, very small, very lovely, but it's extreme in a lot of different directions. To the degree that like hot sauce makes perfect sense to me. Even though like I haven't met a single person in that town who eats hot sauce.
Other questions? Yes.
I personally find titling to be a pain in the ass, and I think you write really great titles, and I'm wondering if you have any advice.
So the question is that titling is hard, and body horror is a fantastic title, and how do you write a good title?
Titling is hard. You are 100% correct. I like to spend a lot of time after I have written the thing thinking about how all of the themes tie together and if there is a single word or phrase that reflects that without describing it too closely. And so there's a lot of like blurry vision that I use when I'm thinking about titling. But I also then do I have a big chalkboard wall in my kitchen that I do a lot of, like when I'm trying to name something, I do a lot of like how normal people would title something and then how like the different like joke versions of how that would be. And usually there's something in the joke version that ends up being the correct thing. But as good as I may or may not be about titling, I'm very good at naming cats. So if you ever have a cat, I will name it for you, free of charge. Just call me.
You should offer some samples, I think, of names.
Current
of
cats, Captain America, and Mitakuye Taku Oyasin More America. This is the new kitten. His name is obviously hybridized between mine and my other cats.
I think my favorite is All Girl Metal Band.
All girl metal band, who then eventually did develop a tumor in her brain and start biting everything, and then it was sad but also kind of predictable.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Hi.
I was wondering, in this sort of climate where everything's changing so rapidly, how do you decide when to stop revising and editing, when to just let something be and turn it in?
It's a great question. The question is, in this time of lots of changes and perspective, lots of takes, I think that can pile on to a topic or issue, how do you know when to stop revising an essay, how to just be done?
It's a very good question. I'm literally not trying to ignore all of the complexities of that question, but you finish it when the editor is like, this needs to be done now. But I'm teaching in my little upstate area. I'm teaching this group of mostly like post-retiree adults writing, and one of them has gotten very invested in telling this story of this former tire like selling facility that burned to the ground and had some trees that were there, but they also burned to the ground. And it sounds like a nothing story, but he is just like deeply researching every aspect of this, and it's turned into this like amazing thing that's also like 9,000 words long, and it's completely justified. And he's like, well, how am I supposed to end this thing? And I think in normal circumstances I'm supposed to be like, after 2,000 words, but I want him to turn it into a book so bad, so I'm like, you don't ever have to end anything, it doesn't matter, just keep going.
Hilarious. I do want to read that. That
I
sounds
know,
exciting.
it's amazing.
One more question. Anyone? Yes. Oh,
Okay.
go ahead.
What's your favorite part of the research process?
Oh, that's nice. What is your favorite part of the research process?
Like 2/3 of the way through, which, keep in mind, you think you're going to research something for an afternoon, so we're talking like 6 months into that, because it always takes longer and you get more excited and you just keep going. So 2/3 of the way into the process, when you finally read enough that you get the thing that you were originally researching, and now you're researching the next level of thing, the things that are peripheral to your original subject of interest, and you find a teeny tiny connection between the new thing and the original thing. And from that teeny tiny connection, you can build out a whole new understanding of the world. And realizing that you have just found that thing is my favorite part. Have you guys hit that yet?
I think so. Hopefully.
Excellent. These are my students, Ian and Jesse, and they're about to present their thesis project. They're so great.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That's a great note to end on, I
Yeah.
think. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, and thanks to Books and Magic for having us.
Thank you. Alrighty, thank you all so much for coming out here tonight and for asking questions. As I mentioned earlier, Anne will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker Elise is going to be pointing right where that is now. It's just in between those two bookshelves. We just ask that you all line up near the front of the store so Elise and I can start breaking down the chairs, move the tables, and we don't hurt you in the process. So that's all. Let's give these two last one round of applause. Thanks so much.
be annoying and take a picture of you guys for the feminist press Instagram. I'm knee deep.